All right, let's dive into some more of these fascinating reports we've got. This time we're focusing on Ukraine and specifically what's going on with the possibility of some peace negotiations and, how this whole conflict is rippling out and affecting the rest of the world. We're talking drone attacks, we're talking political maneuvering, even a proposed 5% defense spending target. So, yeah, lots to unpack.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how all of these reports, kind of expose what's actually happening on the ground, because so much of what we hear is, political rhetoric and propaganda.
Right.
It can be difficult to get a clear picture.
For sure. And speaking of things that are difficult to get a clear picture of, let's talk about these drone attacks on Ukraine. The reports are describing 72 drones launched by Russia lighting up the night sky over Kyiv. And unfortunately, one of those drones hit an apartment building, although thankfully there was only one reported injury.
Yeah, and right away, Russia's coming back with a counter-narrative, right?
Right.
They're accusing Ukraine of launching a missile attack on a supermarket in Donetsk. But the casualty reports, they're kind of all over the place. What's really chilling, though, is that the supermarket's name translates to milk.
It's a tragedy, for sure, and such a stark reminder of the way this conflict impacts civilians. I mean, regardless of who's actually responsible, it makes you wonder, how do we even begin to separate the truth from the propaganda in all of this?
Right. It's a huge question, and something that's really important for us to keep in mind as we're looking at these reports. We hear from both sides that they're trying to avoid civilian casualties, but when we look at what's actually happening,
right,
it tells a very different story. Denis Pushilin, the leader of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, he put out a statement about this attack on a residential building in Svitlodarsk. It killed a woman.
It makes you think, are these attacks intentional? Or is it just negligence?
Yeah.
And how do we hold people accountable when the information is so tightly controlled?
It's definitely a tough question to answer with any kind of certainty. But I think, looking at the patterns of these attacks, the kinds of weapons being used, and what both sides are saying,
right,
I think we can start to piece together a more accurate picture of what's actually happening.
Okay. Well, while all of this is going on, there's also this debate that's brewing about how to prevent further aggression. And this brings us to former President Trump's proposal for NATO countries to increase their defense spending to, get this, 5% of their GDP.
Yeah.
That's more than double the current target. Even the U.S. doesn't hit that number.
Right. And there's a lot of discussion about it, even within NATO itself. Guido Crosetto, Italy's defense minister, he actually said it's impossible for a lot of countries to even get there. Poland's already over 4%.
Wow.
But other countries are struggling to even hit 3%.
So is this just Trump using this as a negotiating tactic? Or does he really think this can happen? What would a 30% increase in defense budgets across Europe even look like?
It's a great question. I mean, you have to think about how that would shift things economically, the impact on social programs, and maybe even increased military tensions within Europe. Could it actually work to deter Russia? Or would it just make things worse?
Yeah. It's a really tricky situation. It kind of reminds me of, when Trump first said he could end this whole conflict in 24 hours. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, totally. And now the conversation has changed, right? It's not hours anymore, it's months. I think it shows a more, maybe you could say, more realistic understanding of how complex it all is.
Right.
That there's not going to be some quick and easy fix for something that's this deeply rooted.
Yeah, it's definitely a long way from those early statements. And it really brings to mind that whole chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's scary how fast things can unravel and the human cost of those failures.
Yeah. And even the timeline is a point of contention. Trump's talking about 6 months, but then you've got his envoy, Doug Kellogg, talking about 100 days. It just highlights how difficult it is to find a solution everyone agrees on, and then to get Moscow, Kyiv, and all the Western allies on the same page.
It seems almost impossible trying to appease everyone.
Right.
And then you add in the European perspective, which has a whole other layer of complexity.
Exactly. European leaders, they're really emphasizing the need for the U.S. to keep supporting Ukraine militarily.
Yeah.
They believe that Ukraine needs to be in a strong position in order for any negotiations to actually work.
It's interesting, though, because Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, she actually said she's confident that Trump can strike that balance, between diplomacy and deterrence.
Yeah.
And it seems like some leaders still have faith in his approach,
right,
even though, he hasn't always been the most predictable.
It's definitely interesting. And I think Meloni's statement really ties into this bigger question of security guarantees for Ukraine. What would those actually look like? Zelensky wants a clear timeline for joining NATO, but you've got Biden, Trump, and Scholz, none of them are willing to commit to that.
Right, and then you've got Macron, who's suggesting putting European troops on Ukrainian soil, which kind of throws another wrench into the whole thing.
Totally. And then on the other side of all of this, you've got Putin, who says he's open to talking, but only if he gets what he wants. No NATO for Ukraine, reduced Western presence in Eastern Europe.
Which, let's be honest, most of the West considers completely unacceptable.
Yeah, pretty much.
So it seems like everyone wants peace, but they all have very different ideas of what that would look like.
It really does feel like a game of chess, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
Definitely. And what's happening in Venezuela really highlights how much bigger this whole thing is than just Ukraine.
Right.
I mean, you've got Maduro securing his third term as president, even with all the accusations of election fraud and irregularities. Democratic leaders like Lula in Brazil and Petro in Colombia, they boycotted the inauguration in Caracas. But then you have allies like Cuba and Nicaragua, they're totally supporting him.
It really underscores that global struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. The conflict in Ukraine has kind of emboldened authoritarian leaders like Maduro because they see the West being distracted and maybe their influence weakening.
And the U.S. response, with the $65 million bounty on Maduro, the sanctions, the accusations of drug trafficking, it just ramps up the tension even more.
Yeah. And then you've got Maduro with his defiant rhetoric. He's claiming this democratizing revolution. But leaders like Shilis Boric, they're calling him a dictator.
It's almost surreal to see these two completely different narratives playing out.
Yeah.
And it's so important to remember the human cost of all of this. Opposition figures forced into exile, calls for peaceful resistance. These are real people whose lives are being completely upended.
Absolutely. And this warning from Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, it really hits home. He said that if Kyiv falls, it could empower authoritarians globally. Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, even the Iranian regime, that's a serious threat to global security.
It's becoming really clear that what's happening in Ukraine and Venezuela, these aren't just isolated incidents. It's all connected.
Exactly. It's all part of a much bigger, more complex picture. And it raises a crucial question. What does responsible global leadership actually look like in this incredibly unpredictable world?
That is a huge question, and one that we'll definitely be exploring further as we continue to unpack all of these incredibly complex issues. But before we do that, I want to speak directly to you, our listener.
Yeah, I think it's important to connect all of this back to how we each understand what's happening in the world.
You might be thinking, what can I do in the face of all of this?
Mm-hmm.
It can feel overwhelming.
Absolutely. It's easy to feel powerless, but there are things we can all do. We can stay informed, engage in thoughtful conversations, and support organizations that are doing work on the ground. Every little bit helps.
It's about raising our voices, holding our leaders accountable, and demanding better.
Yes, exactly. And it's about supporting the people who are fighting for democracy and freedom, whether it's in Ukraine, Venezuela, or anywhere else in the world.
We might not be able to end wars or topple dictators by ourselves, but we can make our voices heard.
And we can support those who are on the front lines of these struggles. Even small acts of solidarity can make a difference.
So as we move on to the next part of this deep dive, I want you to remember that you're not just a passive observer in all of this. You're an engaged citizen, and you have the power to learn, to question, and to act. Who knows, you might just be the one to spark positive change.
It all starts with understanding the complexities of these issues, and that's exactly what we're trying to do in this deep dive.
Now, let's shift our focus to the ongoing efforts to find peace in Ukraine. What are the potential ways forward? And what's standing in the way of a lasting resolution?
To really understand the situation now, we need to go back a little bit and look at how those peace negotiations have gone so far. Remember those early statements from Trump saying he could end the conflict in just 24 hours? Well, as we've seen, things are a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, looking back, those statements seem almost naive. It just goes to show that resolving a conflict of this magnitude, even with the best intentions, takes time, patience, and a deep understanding of the history and the political dynamics that are in play.
For sure. And while Trump has definitely adjusted his timeline, talking about months instead of hours now, there's still this sense of urgency, especially from his envoy, Doug Kellogg, who mentioned 100 days as a target.
That's interesting. These different timelines really make you wonder, is this a genuine push for a lasting solution? Or is it more about politics? Could it be tied to the upcoming election cycle?
That's a valid point. We can't ignore how domestic politics might be influencing the peace process. I mean, finding a quick resolution to the conflict would be a huge political win for the administration.
But as we saw with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, rushing things can have some really unintended consequences. So how do we balance the need to act quickly with the need for a solution that actually lasts?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
And it's one that policymakers are struggling with as they try to navigate these incredibly complex negotiations, not just between Moscow and Kyiv, but also trying to keep the Western allies united.
It seems like a monumental task.
Yeah.
Trying to satisfy everyone while making sure that any peace agreement, if they even reach one, can actually hold up over time.
It is, and that's where the European perspective becomes really important. They're pushing for the U.S. to keep supporting Ukraine militarily. They're arguing that Ukraine needs to be in a strong position for any negotiations to actually be meaningful.
It's fascinating how different leaders are approaching this whole thing. Italian Prime Minister Meloni said she actually believes that Trump can manage this, that he can balance the diplomacy with the deterrence. It seems like she thinks he can succeed where others have failed.
Her statement really raises the question of trust. Can Trump, with his, shall we say, unconventional approach to foreign policy, be trusted to secure a peace that's both fair and sustainable?
Yeah, and it's a question that a lot of people, especially in Europe, are asking. They know that whatever happens in these negotiations will have a huge impact on the security and stability of the entire continent.
And it all circles back to that question of security guarantees for Ukraine. What would those actually look like? Would it involve giving Ukraine a clear path to NATO membership, like Zelensky wants? Or would it be some other kind of security arrangement?
Yeah, there are no easy answers. If you give Ukraine NATO membership, it could provoke Russia, maybe even escalate the conflict. But if you don't, then they're vulnerable to future aggression.
Right. And then you've got Macron suggesting sending European troops to Ukraine, which just complicates things even further.
It's a high-stakes gamble for sure. European leaders are caught between wanting to help Ukraine and being afraid of triggering a bigger conflict.
And then there's Putin. He said he's open to talking, but only on his terms. No NATO for Ukraine, less Western presence in Eastern Europe.
Which is basically a non-starter for most of the West.
Yeah, pretty much.
So we're at a standstill. Everyone wants peace, but they can't agree on what that would even look like.
Right, and it's a situation with incredibly high stakes.
Yeah, it's definitely become this focal point, hasn't it? This struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. And, the whole world's kind of watching to see how the West responds. Are they united? Are they going to stand strong?
It really does feel like everyone's holding their breath. And like we were saying earlier, authoritarian leaders, people like Maduro, they're paying attention to all of this.
And that's why it's so important to look at those wider implications of the conflict.
Right.
It goes way beyond just Ukraine's borders. It could actually reshape the whole global order.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. How could this conflict actually impact the balance of power on a global scale? What are we talking about here? Well, one of the big concerns is the possibility of alliances shifting. We're already seeing Russia and China getting closer. They both want to challenge that U.S.-led world order.
So you're saying if Russia actually achieves its goals in Ukraine, that could make China think, hey, now's our chance to make a move on Taiwan.
Exactly. If the West seems weak in its response to Ukraine, China might see that as an opportunity to, assert itself in its own region.
And what about the impact on global institutions like the UN? Could this whole thing damage their credibility, make them less effective?
The UN's already getting a lot of criticism for how they've handled this conflict. Some people are saying they haven't done anything to prevent or stop the violence. If this drags on, people are going to lose faith in the UN being able to be neutral, a real peacekeeper.
So this goes way beyond just territory, right? It's about the principles and the institutions that are supposed to keep the world order stable.
Exactly. And it's forcing countries to rethink their alliances, what their priorities are. Look at Europe. Germany, for example, they're under pressure to increase their defense spending, be more involved in security in their own backyard.
And it's not just the countries that are directly involved, right? I mean, those sanctions on Russia, they've messed with energy prices and supply chains globally. It just shows you how connected everything really is.
It really does. And it brings us back to something we touched on earlier, the need for responsible global leadership. This conflict has exposed some real weaknesses in the system we have now. We need a better way to govern the world, a way that's more effective and fairer.
Okay, so what does that even look like? How do we get to a more just and sustainable world order? Is that even possible with all the division in the world right now?
It's a huge challenge, but we can't just ignore it. It means we need to change how we think. We can't keep playing these zero-sum games. We need to cooperate, prioritize dialogue and diplomacy, find solutions that work for everyone.
So instead of this us versus them mentality, it's more about recognizing that we're all human and working together to solve the problems that we all face.
Exactly. And that goes for individuals as well as countries. We need to have empathy, understand each other, be willing to talk to people who see things differently. We need to build bridges, not walls.
It's a powerful idea for sure. But realistically, do we see this kind of shift happening anywhere?
There are definitely some signs of hope. We're seeing more and more people and organizations around the world who are dedicated to peace, justice, and sustainability. They're tackling issues like climate change, poverty, inequality, and they realize these aren't just problems for one country. They affect all of us.
So even with all the negativity and polarization, there are people out there trying to make the world better.
Absolutely. And they're having an impact. Change doesn't always happen overnight. It's often a slow process with lots of people and groups working towards the same goal.
That's actually really encouraging. It's a good reminder that even when things seem really dark, there's always hope.
Exactly. And speaking of hope, let's shift back to talking about finding peace in Ukraine. What are some of the paths to get there, and what are the roadblocks that are in the way?
It seems like a really long road to peace. Where do we even start?
Well, I think it's helpful to think about it in a few different categories: military, diplomatic, and economic. Each one has its own opportunities and challenges.
Let's start with the military side. Could one side winning decisively actually lead to a lasting peace?
Probably not. History shows us that even when one side wins a war, it doesn't mean peace will last. It can create resentment and instability, plant the seeds for more conflict down the road.
So even if one side completely defeats the other, it doesn't guarantee an end to the fighting.
Right. Real peace, lasting peace, needs more than just military dominance. You need a political settlement that addresses the root causes of the conflict and gives everyone a way to coexist peacefully.
Which brings us to the diplomatic path. What are the chances of a negotiated settlement?
There are a lot of obstacles. We've talked about how entrenched both sides are, and there's just a lot of mistrust.
But there has to be some common ground, right? Something that both sides can agree on, a starting point for negotiations.
There are some potential areas of compromise. For instance, both sides want to avoid a wider war that pulls in other countries. And they both share a concern for the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding.
So you're saying those shared interests could be a way to start talking.
Exactly. But getting from there to a real peace agreement is going to take some serious diplomatic skill, creative solutions, and a willingness from both sides to give a little.
Which is a lot to ask, especially with all the tension and bad blood between them. What about using economics? Could that pressure help bring about a resolution?
Those sanctions on Russia are definitely having an effect. They're hurting their economy and making it harder to keep the conflict going.
But sanctions can backfire too, can't they? They can hurt regular people and destabilize the economy.
That's true. Sanctions are kind of a blunt instrument. It's hard to use them precisely. There's always the risk of collateral damage, not just to the country you're targeting, but to the whole global economy.
So it's this balancing act, trying to put pressure on Russia without hurting innocent people too much.
Right. And for sanctions to really work, other countries have to be on board. If there are ways around them, or if some countries refuse to participate, they lose a lot of their power.
So it seems like there's no easy fix for this conflict in Ukraine. Every possible solution has its own set of problems and risks.
That's right. And it's important to remember that these different approaches, they're not mutually exclusive. A real successful resolution is probably going to involve a mix of military, diplomatic, and economic strategies, all working together in a very coordinated way.
It sounds pretty complicated. But with all of these challenges, is there any reason to be optimistic? Are there any signs that peace might actually be possible?
There's always reason to hope. Humans are incredibly resilient. Even in the worst situations, there are always people who are working for peace and reconciliation. We've seen it throughout history, and we're seeing it right now in Ukraine.
So even with all the violence and destruction, there are people working behind the scenes to try and find common ground.
Absolutely. There are tons of individuals and organizations, both inside Ukraine and around the world, who are dedicated to peace building. They're fostering dialogue, promoting understanding, trying to create the conditions for a sustainable peace.
It's good to hear that. It reminds us that even when the challenges seem huge, people don't give up hope.
And their work is so important. Building peace is a long and difficult process, but it's the only way to create a world where conflicts like the one in Ukraine are less likely to happen.
So, even though the news is full of the violence and the political battles, it's important to remember there are people working hard to build a better future for Ukraine and for the world.
Exactly. And those efforts deserve our attention and support. By talking about these peace-building efforts, we can help amplify their voices and contribute to a more peaceful and just world.
That's a really powerful thought. And before we finish this part of our deep dive, I want to mention one more thing about the Ukraine conflict that we haven't really talked about: the role of technology.
You're right, we should definitely talk about that. Technology is becoming more and more important in modern warfare, and what's happening in Ukraine is a perfect example.
So how is technology changing the way wars are fought? What are some of the big tech developments that are impacting this conflict?
Well, we're seeing things like advanced drones, sophisticated cyber warfare, even artificial intelligence. These technologies are changing the very nature of war. It's becoming more precise, more deadly, and potentially a lot less predictable.
It's a little scary to think about technology being used in war like this. I mean, could these advancements actually make conflicts more likely to escalate? Or could they make war more targeted, less destructive overall?
It's a tough question, and it's one that military strategists and ethicists are really struggling with. Some people argue that these technologies could help reduce civilian casualties because they allow for more precise targeting. But they could also make it easier for countries to start wars since it's less risky than traditional military operations.
So it's a double-edged sword. It could make war less brutal, but also make it more tempting to fight in the first place.
Exactly. And this brings up some big ethical questions. How do we make sure these technologies are used responsibly? How do we keep them out of the wrong hands? How do we create rules and standards for using them in war?
Those are huge questions, and I don't think there are any easy answers. It feels like we're entering uncharted territory, where the lines between war and peace, between humans and machines, are getting blurrier all the time.
It's a complicated situation, and it's changing fast. We really need to pay attention. The decisions we make today about how these technologies are developed and used are going to have a huge impact on the future of war and on humanity itself.
It's kind of a sobering thought, but also empowering in a way. We as citizens have a responsibility to shape this future. We need to demand that these technologies are used ethically and responsibly.
Absolutely. We can't just leave these decisions to governments and military leaders. We need to have a public discussion about the implications of these technologies and push for policies that prioritize peace, security, and human well-being.
It's a call to action for everyone. We need to be informed, engaged, and speak up about the role of technology in our world. We need to make sure it's used to help humanity, not threaten it.
Exactly. It's about using the power of technology for good while also limiting the potential for harm. It's not easy, but it's something we have to do if we want a more peaceful and just future.
That's a great note to end on. But before we move to the last part of our deep dive, I want to encourage you, our listener, to think about everything we've talked about so far.
Yeah, take a moment to consider how all of this is impacting your own life and how you see the world.
What really stands out to you? What questions are you left with? How does all of this connect to your own values and beliefs?
Thinking about these questions is how we become informed and active citizens. It's about going beyond just passively listening to the news and really trying to understand the forces that are shaping our world.
Remember, you have a voice, and what you think matters. Stay informed, share your thoughts, and have those difficult conversations. You can contribute to a more just and peaceful future.
And now in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to tackle a question that's been at the heart of so many global discussions. What does responsible global leadership really look like in this increasingly volatile world?
It's a question that deserves our attention, because the choices that leaders make today will have a huge impact on generations to come. Join us as we explore this topic, looking at the qualities, the actions, and the decisions that define true leadership in these difficult times. So here we are, the final part of our deep dive, and it feels like the perfect time to really dig into this question of, what does responsible global leadership look like in a world that's this complicated and constantly changing, especially with everything going on in Ukraine and Venezuela. It feels more urgent than ever.
Yeah, it's a question that goes way beyond those specific situations, though. I mean, look around. We're dealing with interconnected challenges everywhere you look. Climate change, economies all over the place, authoritarianism on the rise, technology changing everything. It's a lot.
It really is. So in this kind of world, how do we even define what responsible leadership is? What qualities do leaders need to have to handle all of this effectively?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that everything is connected. You know, responsible leaders, they get that the problems we're facing aren't just limited to one country. They require solutions that involve everyone working together. They see the world as this, like, interconnected web, right? What happens in one place affects everyone else.
So it's about moving past that narrow, like, my country first kind of thinking and taking a more global perspective.
Exactly. It's about understanding that we're all in this together, that we all share the same fate. Isolationism and going it alone just don't work in a world where everyone is facing the same problems.
And it seems like empathy is a really crucial quality for leaders to have in this kind of world.
Oh, absolutely. Responsible leaders need to be able to understand and share the feelings of others, even people who see things differently or come from different backgrounds. They see diversity of thought and experience as a good thing, not something to be afraid of.
So it's not just about making decisions based on pure logic. It's about understanding how those decisions will actually affect people's lives.
Right. It's about having a deep understanding of what it means to be human, realizing that policies and decisions have real consequences for real people.
And that empathy needs to extend beyond just the people in their own country.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that every human being has value and deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter where they come from or what they believe.
Integrity also seems like a key element of responsible leadership.
Oh, absolutely. Responsible leaders, they operate based on a strong moral compass. They're honest, they're transparent, they take responsibility for what they do, they're committed to doing what's right, even when it's hard or unpopular.
So it's not just talk, it's about actually living those values.
Exactly. It's about walking the walk, showing that you're committed to doing the right thing, even when things get tough.
And it seems like courage is another essential quality for leaders to have, especially in these challenging times.
No question. Responsible leaders aren't afraid to make tough calls, to stand up for what they believe in, even when people are pushing back. They're not afraid to challenge the way things are, to speak truth to power, and to fight for change.
So it's about being willing to take risks, step outside your comfort zone, and stand up for what's right, even when it's hard.
Right. And it's about inspiring others to do the same, to be part of making change happen in their own communities and in the world.
Okay, so we've talked about the qualities of responsible leadership, but what about the actions? What concrete things can leaders do to actually address all of these challenges?
Well, I think one of the most important things is fostering dialogue and cooperation. Responsible leaders get that there are rarely easy answers to complex problems. They know they need to bring different people to the table, encourage real conversations, and build agreement around common goals.
So it's about creating spaces where people can come together, share their ideas, and work together to find solutions.
Exactly. It's about breaking down barriers, building bridges, and creating a culture of collaboration.
What about diplomacy? What role does that play in responsible leadership?
Diplomacy is crucial, especially in this interconnected world. Responsible leaders, they make diplomacy a priority. It's how they resolve conflicts peacefully, build relationships, and help countries understand each other.
So it's about investing in diplomacy, building strong relationships with other countries, and talking things out, even with people we disagree with.
Right. It's about understanding that talking is always better than fighting, that even the toughest disagreements can be worked out peacefully if everyone's willing to come to the table in good faith.
We've talked about dialogue, diplomacy, working together, but what about actually taking action? What about doing something concrete?
Yeah, responsible leaders, they know that words aren't enough. They actually do things to address the challenges facing their communities and the world. They invest in things like education, healthcare, infrastructure. They push for sustainable development, protect the environment, and stand up for human rights.
So it's about putting your money where your mouth is, actually taking steps to make a better future for everyone.
Exactly, and doing it in a way that's sustainable and fair, making sure everyone benefits from progress and no one is left out.
It's a pretty inspiring vision of leadership, but it's also a big challenge. As we wrap up this deep dive, though, I want to make sure we emphasize that responsible leadership isn't just about people in positions of power.
That's such an important point. Every single person can be a leader, can make a difference in their own way.
So what does that kind of leadership look like on an individual level?
It starts with looking inward, understanding our own values, what we believe, and even our own biases. It's about being informed, engaged, and active in our communities. It's about speaking up when we see injustice, advocating for people who are marginalized, and working towards a world that's more just and fair.
So it's about taking responsibility for what we do, recognizing that even small acts of kindness, compassion, and bravery can have a ripple effect, inspiring others to do the same.
Exactly. It's about realizing that we all have a part to play in creating the world we want to live in. Leadership isn't a title, it's a way of thinking, a commitment to making a positive difference.
That's a powerful message, and one I hope our listeners will carry with them. We've explored a lot in this deep dive into the Ukraine conflict. We've looked at the heartbreaking realities on the ground, the complex global implications, and the efforts to find peace.
And we've also really dug into this idea of responsible leadership in a world that's facing challenges like never before.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought.
The world needs responsible leaders more than ever. Leaders who can navigate the complexities, bring people together, and inspire hope. Leaders who are committed to peace, justice, and a sustainable future.
And those leaders aren't just in government. They're in our schools, our communities, and everyday acts of courage and kindness.
The future isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the choices we make today, both as individuals and as a global community.
So let this deep dive be a call to action. A reminder that each one of us has the power to make a difference.
Stay informed, talk to each other, and never underestimate the power of your voice.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep learning, questioning, and engaging with the world around you.